Hadley, United Kingdom, 1971. A small photo lab is operating as usual, developing film, chemical solutions, scheduled shifts. People are doing their jobs, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But within a few days, several employees report the same complaints. At first, it looks like a common ailment: nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain. Some fall ill right at their workplace, while others go home early. Several people take sick leave and stay home, hoping it will pass on its own. The first visits to doctors raise no alarms. The diagnosis sounds familiar: a viral infection. In the early 70s, such cases were common. Lab tests show nothing specific. Standard treatment is prescribed, along with recommendations for rest. But time passes, and the condition of those who are sick does not improve. For some, the symptoms intensify. People become tired quickly, lose weight, and complain of constant weakness. A few begin to lose their hair. This looks strange for a virus, but the theory remains unchanged. One of the employees, Bob Eagle, is having a harder time than the others. His condition deteriorates more rapidly. He can barely eat. The pain becomes constant. Medication has no effect. His health continues to worsen day by day. A short time later, Bob Eagle passes away. The documents record it as a complication of his illness. Formally, everything seems logical. There is a diagnosis, a decline, and an outcome. At this stage, no one speaks of a crime, but some of the doctors are left with a feeling that the picture doesn't add up. The symptoms are too disparate: hair loss, severe pain, the gradual breakdown of the body. None of it fits neatly into the typical course of an infection. After discussions, a decision is made to conduct a forensic medical examination. Not as a formality or to check a box. They need to understand what exactly caused what was happening. The results of the examination change the entire picture. A high concentration of thallium is found in Bob Eagle's tissues. It is a heavy metal and a potent poison. Its effects develop gradually. Symptoms do not appear immediately but build over time, exactly as it had happened with the sick employees of the photo lab. The virus theory vanishes. What is happening is no longer considered a medical case. The concentration of the substance is too high to be attributed to accidental contact with chemicals or a production error. This was not an accident. The examination materials are handed over to the police. From that moment, the photo lab in Hadley ceases to be just a workplace. It becomes the starting point of a criminal case. And the strange illness, which until recently they had tried to treat with pills and rest, takes on a completely different meaning. After the examination results reach the police, the range of possible theories narrows sharply. Thallium is not a substance one might encounter by chance. It is not a household chemical or a manufacturing mistake. To work with it, one must understand exactly what they are doing and how it affects the body. Investigators start with the obvious place: the photo lab. Chemical solutions are used here daily. There are reagents, processes, and access to substances. They check the premises, workstations, and employee lists. There are not many people. Everyone is known by name. There are no outsiders. The check proceeds calmly. At this stage, no one looks suspicious. It is important to understand who had access to the chemicals without raising questions from management. A name appears on the list that initially seems insignificant: Graham Young. He had joined the lab very recently. He was hired without much discussion. He met the formal criteria and did not require additional supervision. To the employer, he was a person who knew how to work with chemical processes and did not seem problematic. A background check reveals nothing alarming at first glance. He was born in 1947 and grew up in a working-class family. His father noticed early on his ability to grasp technical subjects, especially those requiring precision and attention to detail. His interest in chemistry began in his school years. He read a lot, collected educational materials, and understood reactions and the properties of substances. His teachers noted his knowledge. He was withdrawn, but a good student. This was not perceived as a deviation. Graham's subsequent path cannot be called smooth. His biography contains a long period that is not reflected in standard employment records. This gap is not advertised and raises no questions during a superficial check of his documents. By the time he is employed at the photo lab, he has not been free for very long. Formally, he is not restricted in his choice of work. His past is not accompanied by notes that would require special treatment from an employer. To the lab's management, he looks like a suitable candidate. He has the knowledge, is not confrontational, does not ask unnecessary questions, and is willing to perform routine tasks. There are no external reasons to refuse him. His colleagues remember him in the same way: quiet, composed. He arrives on time, does his work, and does not try to stand out. He rarely participates in discussions. To most, he is just another employee, recently hired for the shift. No one is interested in how much time he has spent outside of ordinary life or why there are gaps in his biography. The documents do not require explanations. Formally, everything is in order. It is at this point that the story begins to look dangerously ordinary. A person with deep knowledge of chemistry and an unspoken past finds himself in an environment where that knowledge is easily applicable. And this happens almost immediately after the system officially deems him safe.
To understand where this story originates, the investigation has to take a step back. Not to the photo lab and not to Broadmoor, much earlier, to the early 1960s, to the Young family home. During that period, nothing seemed alarming, a typical family, daily life. But at some point, one after another, strange episodes begin to occur. First, the father falls ill. Sharp abdominal pains, weakness, a general decline in health. Doctors speak of digestive problems. They prescribe treatment. After some time, similar symptoms appear in his sister. Again, pain, nausea, weakness. The diagnoses sound vague. They mention a possible infection or a reaction to food. No in-depth examinations are conducted. Against this backdrop, Graham's behavior raises no suspicion. He stays at home, helps with chores, and brings food and drinks. To outsiders, it looks like care and concern. He spends a lot of time with his relatives, especially when they feel worse.
The condition of his stepmother, Molly Young, deteriorates more than the others. The pain becomes constant. She can barely eat. The prescribed treatment yields no results. Her condition changes gradually, day by day. Doctors can find no clear explanation for what is happening. Graham is increasingly by her side. He brings her tea, water, food. This is remembered as him being helpful. No suspicions arise at the time. On the contrary, his involvement is seen positively. In time, Molly passes away. Official documents list the cause as an illness unrelated to poison exposure. No forensic examination is performed. They see no reason for it. The case is not considered criminal. After this, the condition of the other family members gradually stabilizes. The pain recedes. The complaints disappear. This is perceived as the natural conclusion of an illness and successful treatment. The episode is considered closed. What happened remains without explanation. No questions are asked. No conclusions are drawn. These events do not appear in police reports and are not recorded as anything unusual. Only years later, when the facts begin to form a single picture, does it become clear that this period was the first link in the chain. At the time, it looked like a series of misfortunes. Now, it begins to be seen as something else entirely. It is to this point that the investigation later returns, already knowing what they did not know in the early 60s,
And it is here that it becomes clear that the story that began in the photo lab actually has a much earlier beginning. Some time passes after the events in the young family home. Life outwardly returns to its usual course. The illnesses recede, and talk of the strange symptoms gradually fades away. For those around them, it remains an episode that had no follow-up and required no explanation. But Graham's interest in chemistry does not disappear. On the contrary, over time, it becomes more focused and purposeful. At school, he increasingly stays after classes. He works with reagents and asks questions that go beyond the curriculum. He's particularly drawn to topics related to the effects of substances on the human body. One of his chemistry teachers begins to notice this, not because Graham is breaking the rules, but because his knowledge seems unusually deep. He fluently uses terminology and knows the properties of compounds rarely discussed in class. There is no showmanship in this, but rather a calm confidence. At some point, the teacher notices containers of substances in his desk that are not used in the educational process. The names are familiar to a specialist. They are compounds with pronounced toxic properties. Their presence in a school classroom raises questions. The conversation with Graham proceeds without conflict. He does not deny the discovery and does not try to hide the origin of the substances. He explains it all as scientific interest. He speaks calmly, without tension, using precise formulations. His explanations sound logical and do not contradict known facts. The school administration initially tries to handle the situation internally. Formally, there are no grounds for harsh measures. The substances are confiscated. A note is made. The situation is considered unpleasant but not critical. However, the story does not end there. A relative of Graham's, his aunt, learns of the school episode. For her, it becomes an alarming sign. Memories of the events at the family home resurface. The illnesses, Molly's deteriorating condition, coincidences that previously had not seemed connected. She does not make accusations or speak of a crime. She shares her doubts. She says that Graham knows far too much about things that can be dangerous. These words are not spoken loudly, but they come at the right moment. The information reaches the police, still without formal accusations, more as a reason to pay attention. For law enforcement, it looks like a combination of several factors: the school discovery, the family episodes, a level of knowledge inconsistent with his age and environment. A decision is made for the first official step. Not a search and not an arrest, an evaluation with a specialist is scheduled. Formally, it is an assessment of his state and thought patterns, a check that should either dispel the doubts or provide a direction for further action. At this stage, Graham is still not considered a criminal. He is on their radar, but without labels. The system acts cautiously, trying not to jump to premature conclusions. It is here that the story first extends beyond the family and the school. From this moment on, what is happening ceases to be a private matter and becomes the subject of official attention. Quiet curiosity is replaced by procedure, and the knowledge that once seemed just a hobby begins to be viewed from a completely different angle. The decision for an evaluation with a specialist is made in early 1962. At this stage, the police are still acting as cautiously as possible. No accusations, no talk of a crime. Formally, it is a consultation intended to help them understand exactly who they are dealing with. The meeting takes place in a calm setting. An office, a standard procedure, notes being taken. Graham behaves confidently. He does not seem frightened and shows no tension. He answers questions in detail and without hesitation. When the conversation turns to chemistry, he feels particularly at ease. He easily explains the principles of how various substances work. He talks about dosages, time intervals, and the cumulative effect. He uses precise terminology. His level of knowledge noticeably exceeds what one would typically expect to hear in such a situation. At first, the conversation remains on a theoretical level. They discuss books,
experiments, and an interest in science. But gradually, the specialist shifts the focus to practice, to how this knowledge was applied outside of an academic environment. Graham does not evade the topic. He calmly talks about his own observations, about how he tested the effects of substances, about how people's conditions changed over time. There are no excuses in his speech and no attempts to soften what he says. He speaks of it as a process. When the conversation touches on the events at the Young family home in 1961, he confirms his involvement. He describes in detail the conditions of his father and sister. Then he speaks of Molly, about how he recorded the changes, how he selected the amount of the substance, how he observed the body's reaction. At this point, it becomes clear that the conversation has gone beyond diagnosis. It is no longer a discussion of interests or an attempt to understand his thinking. It is a confession, and a confession supported by details that would be impossible to invent on the spot. The specialist records what he has heard and passes the information to the police. This happens in the same year, 1962. Further actions unfold quickly, but without dramatic haste. His testimony is compared with medical documents and relatives' recollections. The timeline matches. Graham officially confirms that his actions led to severe consequences within his family and to Molly's death. These words are documented. The theory of accidental illnesses definitively loses its standing. In April 1962, the decision is made to arrest him. The wording is dry and restrained. It refers to premeditated actions, confirmed by a confession and circumstantial evidence. For the system, this is the first moment when Graham ceases to be an object of observation and becomes the central figure of the case. At this stage, there is a sense that the situation has been explained and brought under control. The confession is recorded, the facts are compared. Intervention has occurred. From a procedural standpoint, everything appears to be concluded, but it is precisely this sense of finality that will later prove to be deceptive. Because from this point on, the focus shifts from the events themselves to the state of the person who committed them. And the decisions made in 1962 will determine the course of the entire story for years to come. After these confessions, the case ceases to be a collection of verbal testimonies. For the police, that is not enough. Any words must be confirmed by facts, especially when the events had long appeared to be a series of unexplained illnesses and had not raised official questions. In May 1962, a decision is made to search Graham's room. This is not an emergency action or a demonstrative measure. Rather, it is a logical continuation of the investigation already underway. It is necessary to determine whether his words correspond to reality and if there is material evidence of what he spoke about during the evaluation. The search is conducted calmly, without pressure and without haste. The room looks ordinary. Books, notebooks, personal belongings, nothing that immediately catches the eye. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that this is not simply the space of a person with an academic interest in science. In drawers and on shelves, they find substances not used in school classes. The containers are neatly labeled. The names are precise, without errors. These are compounds that require an understanding of dosages and consequences to handle. Their presence confirms that his interest in chemistry went far beyond theory. Nearby, they discover literature on toxicology, not popular editions or introductory manuals. These are specialized reference books that detail the effects of substances on the body, reaction speeds, and cumulative effects. For the early 1960s, such a collection of sources outside a professional environment looks unusual. The notebooks attract special attention. At first glance, they are ordinary notes, but inside, a strict system is discovered. Dates, times, brief notes on the condition of specific people. No emotions and no comments, only a record of observations. These records specify the quantities of substances and the methods of their administration. Changes in health over time are noted. Separate pages are dedicated to Molly. The chronology perfectly matches the period of her deteriorating condition in 1961. The records show that what happened was not accidental. It was a process drawn out over time, with planning, observation, and documentation of the results. All of this directly confirms what Graham said during his evaluation with the specialist. All the discovered materials are seized and sent for expert analysis. Over the summer of 1962, specialists confirmed that the substances found and the effects described correspond to one another. The specified quantities and reactions match the known toxicological data of the time.
After this, the focus shifts from the events themselves to Graham's state. His age at the time of the events, the nature of his records, and the complete absence of any emotional assessment of the consequences become key factors. Additional medical examinations are ordered. By the end of 1962, a general conclusion is formed. Specialists conclude that he did not comprehend what was happening in the way it is understood within normal legal frameworks. His actions are seen as the result of a distorted perception and a deep fixation on the process rather than on the consequences for others. Based on these findings, a legal decision is made. Criminal proceedings in the standard format are not pursued. Instead, he is found to be insane and sent for compulsory treatment to the high-security Broadmoor Hospital. In early 1963, Graham finds himself within its walls. To the system, this looks like a considered and rational decision. Confessions have been obtained.
Material evidence has been examined. A medical assessment has been conducted. The individual is isolated and placed under constant observation. At that moment, there is a sense that the situation has reached a final resolution. Everything that posed a risk is now confined within the institution's framework and controlled by specialists. It is here that the story seems to pause. Formally, it is closed, but this pause will later prove to be the most deceptive part of the entire chain of events. The first few months inside pass quietly. The routine is strict, the rules are clear, observation is constant. To the staff, Graham becomes one of many patients they will have to monitor for years. He is not singled out or considered problematic. He follows the regimen, does not get into conflicts, and does not violate established boundaries. Doctors note his calmness and ability to control his behavior. Reports begin to use phrases about a stable condition and the absence of external signs of danger. He spends most of his time reading. His interests do not change. He requests literature on chemistry, toxicology, and botany. Formally, such books are not forbidden. At Broadmoor, it is believed that intellectual activity reduces tension and aids in treatment. The institution has a garden. Working with the land is used as part of the therapeutic program. Patients care for plants, spend time outdoors, and perform simple tasks. Graham quickly becomes involved in this activity. He is neat, attentive, and does not draw unnecessary attention to himself. Over time, the staff notices that his interest is focused on certain types of plants, mostly those whose properties are described as potentially dangerous. He does not hide this and explains it all as scientific curiosity. He speaks calmly, without any hint of hidden intentions. There are no formal grounds to restrict his activities. He does not break the rules and does not go beyond what is permitted. In the documents, this appears as part of the adaptation and therapy process. Years go by without any major incidents. The reports become repetitive. His behavior is described as stable. No violations are recorded. Doctors increasingly use phrases about positive progress. But gradually, strange episodes begin to occur within the institution. Several patients experience a sharp decline in health, weakness, nausea, and general malaise. At first, this is attributed to the patient's own underlying conditions. Later, similar symptoms are noted among the staff. They check the food, water, and living conditions. No direct causes are found. The episodes seem isolated, but over time, there are too many to ignore completely. Graham's name begins to surface in conversations among the staff, unofficially. His knowledge, his work in the garden, and his past events gradually form an alarming picture. A nickname reflecting the general feeling of what is happening emerges among patients and staff. They start calling him the Broadmoor Poisoner. Officially, this is not recorded anywhere. To the administration, such talk seems like speculation, without proof and without specific facts. From the outside, all of this looks like a normal and calm period of observation. The reports increasingly repeat the same phrases: behavior stable, no violations recorded. Interaction with staff is even-keeled. These records accumulate year after year and gradually form a general impression. By the late 1960s, the focus shifts. Doctors refer less and less to the early events and more frequently assess his current state. What was once perceived as a dangerous fixation is now described as a faded interest. The language becomes more cautious and softer. In 1970, preparations for a final assessment begin. This is a standard procedure. Observations from the entire period of his stay, medical conclusions, and behavioral reports are analyzed. The decision is not made in a single moment. It is formed gradually through a series of commissions and approvals. In early 1971, the psychiatrists at Broadmoor reach a unanimous conclusion. The documents contain the phrase, "fully recovered." It is stated that his interest in poisons is no longer obsessive and is considered a past phase. His capacity for self-control and the absence of any signs of threat to others are noted. A separate section is devoted to his future adaptation. It states that upon returning to society, he is capable of leading a normal life and working within general rules. No restrictions or warnings are specified in the materials. No formal grounds for them are found. In the spring of 1971, the final decision is made. Graham leaves the walls of the institution. To the system, this looks like the conclusion of a long and successful process. A person deemed dangerous in the early 60s is now considered safe and socially adapted. His medical past remains within the archives. This information does not accompany him outside the institution and is not passed on to employers. He returns to society without external marks and without formal restrictions. On paper, everything looks complete. Treatment finished. Observation ended. The Broadmoor story is officially closed. It is from this moment that the next part of the story begins, the part where the conclusions reached in offices first collide with the reality outside the institution. On paper, everything looked consistent and neat. Commissions were passed, conclusions were drafted, decisions were signed. But upon closer examination, a gap becomes apparent between what was recorded in the reports and what remained outside of them. The medical documents compiled over years of observation at Broadmoor are largely similar. They regularly emphasize his high level of intelligence. Good memory, logical thinking, and analytical abilities are noted. These qualities are seen as signs of recovery and social adaptation. In parallel, other details appear in the records: a cold communication style, emotional restraint, and ability to maintain distance. These traits are recorded but are not given a separate evaluation and are not perceived as a risk factor. Doctors note that Graham quickly understands the structure of a conversation. He understands what answers are expected and constructs the conversation accordingly. Over time, his speech becomes smooth, calm, and socially acceptable. This is perceived as positive progress. Behavioral control is interpreted as a result of treatment. At the same time, the question of whether this is an internal change or merely an external adaptation to the specialist's expectations is barely discussed. Separate records mention his ability to manage a conversation and direct the dialogue, but these observations are not followed up on. High intelligence is seen as a resource for self-control, rather than a potential tool for concealing intentions. The context of the time also plays a role. In the early 70s, psychopathy was not yet perceived as a stable personality disorder with long-term risks. The diagnosis was used cautiously. The absence of conflicts and disciplinary violations outweighed other troubling signals. As a result, the evaluation focuses on external behavior rather than personality structure. The ability to appear socially acceptable is taken as a sign of being cured. The decision for his release is based on formal indicators. Behavior is stable, no violations, progress is documented. The documents find no grounds for restrictions. This failure was not due to negligence or haste. It was a consequence of the chosen evaluation model. The system trusted the reports more than unformulated doubts. The paper proved more convincing than uneasy feelings.
The consequences of this decision become real very quickly. A person with such a past returns to an ordinary environment without monitoring or restrictions. His knowledge and experience remain with him, and everything that could have served as a warning remains in an archive. It is this chain of decisions that leads to the next stage of the story. His release opens the way for him to find a job where chemistry once again becomes part of daily life, and the mistakes made in offices begin to manifest outside their walls. By the summer of 1971, the investigation in Hadley reaches a dead end. The reason for the deteriorating health of the photolab employees remains unclear, although the main theories have already been checked and have not been confirmed. A production error is ruled out. The reagents meet standards, storage conditions have not been violated, and several people had access to the chemicals. The technical explanation for what is happening gradually loses its force. Questioning the employees also yields no results. No serious conflicts have been identified. The team is described as calm and professional. Nothing points to personal motives or hidden tension. At this stage, Graham Young remains out of focus. He was hired recently, performs his tasks carefully, does not get into arguments, and does not stand out among the others. To the police, he looks like a background employee with no signs of involvement. The investigation continues, but without a clear direction. The symptoms are alarming, but their source is still not identified. The breakthrough comes unexpectedly. Graham himself approaches a doctor, not because of his own condition and not with complaints. He shares an observation. He calmly states that the cause of what is happening could be thallium poisoning. He explains this based on the nature of the symptoms and the properties of the substance. His speech is even, confident, and emotionless, like that of a person reasoning theoretically. To the doctors, this sounds strange. Thallium was not a standard theory. It is a rare and specific substance. To mention it, one needs to have a good understanding of how it works and where it might be used. The information is passed on to the police, initially without much emphasis as an unusual detail, but the fact itself stands out immediately. A lab employee who is not a specialist in the field accurately names the substance that will later prove to be key. Formally, Young is still not a suspect, but from this moment on he ceases to be inconspicuous. His knowledge seems too precise to be overlooked. The investigation returns to the employee list with a new focus, and the person who until then seemed just a quiet participant in the process begins to occupy a very different place in this story. The overly precise suggestion does not remain just a conversation. The attention that has arisen around Graham Young's name quickly moves into a formal sphere. His knowledge does not seem random. It is too specific for an ordinary photolab employee. Investigators begin with a basic procedure, a background check. Inquiries to archives, a cross-check of employment and medical records. Usually, such checks do not bring surprises. This time, things turn out differently. A gap is discovered in his records, several years that are not explained by a change of job or a move. For the police, this is a clear signal. Such pauses are rarely empty. The inquiries go deeper, into the archives of medical institutions and court materials. The answers come back gradually, and with each new document, the picture becomes clearer. In materials from the early 1960s, the name Graham Young appears. The events within his family are described, the prolonged health decline of his relatives, the death of his stepmother, Molly Young. At the time, these episodes were not given a criminal assessment, but they were later re-examined. The documents record that in 1962, Young gave a confession. He described his actions in detail, the use of toxic substances, observation of the reactions, and recording of changes in condition. These details directly echo what he would demonstrate many years later in Hadley. Next comes the medical report. He was declared insane and sent for compulsory treatment. For almost 9 years, he was held at Broadmoor under constant observation. There are separate documents regarding his release. In early 1971, he was deemed to have recovered and to be capable of returning to a normal life. Formally, everything appears correct. There are no restrictions or warnings in the files. For the investigation, this becomes a turning point. The new, quiet employee of the photo lab turns out to be a man with a documented past directly linked to poisonings. The coincidence with the current events in Hadley no longer seems random. The symptoms, the mention of a rare substance, the behavior that previously seemed neutral, it is all now seen in a different light. From this moment, Young ceases to be a background character. His past explains his knowledge, his composure, and his lack of reaction to the events. Everything that had previously gone unnoticed now falls into place. The investigation takes a sharp turn. A story that began as a search for the cause of strange illnesses now leads to a man whom the system had once declared safe. And it is this very decision that becomes the starting point for the next step. Once Graham Young's past becomes known to the police, the conversation with him is no longer a formal check. It is no longer about clarifying details or exchanging theories. It is a direct confrontation. The difficulty is that the investigators are facing a man who understands poisons better than most of them.
Young is summoned officially. Without any abrupt moves or pressure, formally he is not yet under arrest. The conversation is conducted calmly, and he senses this from the first moments. He enters composed. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't ask unnecessary questions. His speech is steady, his tone calm. He listens attentively and pauses before answering, like a man accustomed to controlling a conversation. He reacts to the accusations with denial. He says he has nothing to do with what is happening in the photo lab. He emphasizes that he only performed technical tasks. He denies any intentional interference. When the conversation turns to chemical substances, the balance shifts noticeably. On this topic, Young feels confident. He clarifies formulations, corrects details, and explains the properties of substances as if he were talking not to the police, but to colleagues. Gradually, he himself begins to set the pace of the conversation.
At one point, he suggests they test for the presence of thallium in his system. He does this calmly, without any showmanship. He explains that traces of the substance could have appeared through normal laboratory contact. This is not an impulsive move. He understands in advance how such a test will end. The analysis will not be direct proof, and he uses this as an argument in his favor. The investigators see this, but at that moment they do not have a sufficient basis to push further within the interrogation. Formally, Young stays within permissible bounds. He makes no confession, no slips of the tongue, and gives them nothing to latch onto. The conversation ends with no direct result. If assessed literally, there is no confession, but the interrogation gives the police a different understanding. They are facing a man who is not just defending himself, but consciously controlling the conversation. After this, a different decision is made. If words aren't working, they need to find facts. The investigation shifts from conversation to action. A search warrant is obtained. Attention shifts to Young's apartment, his personal belongings, and his work locker at the photo lab. Anything that might provide answers without interpretations or excuses. From this moment, the confrontation moves beyond the interview room, and what becomes decisive next is not what he says, but what they manage to find. The search is the moment when conversations finally take a back seat. After obtaining the warrant, the police no longer rely on Young's explanations and his confident demeanor. The focus now is on the objects and records to which he had direct access. The search of the apartment is conducted sequentially and without haste. Each room is documented separately. Personal belongings are checked methodically. Even at this stage, it becomes clear that this space was used for more than just living. In the cupboards, they discover containers of chemical substances. Some of the containers lack factory labels. Some are labeled by hand. Among the findings are thallium and other toxic compounds unrelated to either his domestic life or his official duties. The storage appears deliberate. The substances are arranged neatly and are in a usable condition. These are not accidental remnants or forgotten materials. Everything points to systematic use. Simultaneously, a search of his work locker in the photo lab is conducted. There they find additional glassware and notes made during work hours. These items directly link his personal activities to the professional environment. The main discovery is made later. In one of the drawers lies a notebook with no cover or external markings. It looks unremarkable. It is this notebook that becomes the key piece of evidence. Inside are regular and clear entries, dates, names, dosage notations, brief comments. The text is dry, without explanations or emotions. In structure, it more closely resembles a lab journal than personal notes. The entries record who was administered the substance and in what quantity. The time of symptom onset and the body's reaction are noted. Brief assessments of the person's condition are given on separate lines. No doubt, no sympathy, only observation and calculation. The people in these entries are presented not as individuals, but as subjects of observation. Specific entries coincide with the events at the photo lab. The dates correspond to the days when employees' health deteriorated. The described reactions perfectly match what doctors would later record. At this stage, all the pieces come together. His knowledge, his access, and his documented actions all fall into a single line. Random coincidences no longer work as an explanation. The search concludes the part of the story where the outcome depended on words and theories. From here on, the investigation will be built on evidence that requires no interpretations or excuses. It is these findings that become the basis for the next step when the case moves from a search to the formation of official charges. When the materials from the search are placed before him, the nature of the conversation changes immediately. On the table lies the notebook with his entries, found in his apartment. This is no longer circumstantial evidence or speculation. These are recorded actions, documented in his own hand. His reaction is noticeable almost immediately. The former composure he maintained during interrogations gradually disappears. He no longer clarifies formulations or corrects details. His attention is focused on the pages. The pauses between his answers grow longer. The investigators do not rush. They do not push or increase the pressure. They give him time to realize that the entries cannot be explained away as coincidence or error. The dates, names, and dosages form a clear sequence. After some time, his manner of speaking changes. The defensiveness vanishes. A different kind of confidence emerges. He stops denying and begins to discuss the contents of the notebook. He speaks of his actions as a planned process. He uses precise, dry formulations. He comments on his calculations, explains his choice of doses, and describes his observations. There is no attempt in his words to justify or downplay what happened. On the contrary, there is a sense of satisfaction with the work he has done. He specifically emphasizes that nothing that happened was impulsive. He talks about the preparation, the selection of substances, the recording of reactions. His speech resembles a report compiled for himself. When the conversation shifts to the events at the photo lab, he no longer distances himself. He confirms that the employees became part of his experiments. He names names. He describes the sequence of his actions.
He specifies the time frames. In this same conversation, he admits his involvement in what happened to Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs. His tone remains even and detached. He speaks of the consequences in the same way he speaks of doses and timelines. He also confirms attempting to affect other colleagues whose conditions worsened but did not lead to irreversible consequences. He describes these episodes as unfinished stages. For the investigation, this becomes the final confirmation of the picture they have assembled. Until this moment, there was room for interpretation. Now, the confession fully aligns with the evidence found and the facts verified. What is also important is how he speaks, not under pressure and not in an attempt to evade responsibility. His words sound as if the need to hide anything has disappeared, along with his control over the situation. At this point, the confrontation ends. The game he had been playing for years becomes impossible. The story emerges from the shadows and moves into the official realm, where further developments will be determined not by his words, but by legal procedures and documented evidence. At first glance, what was happening looked ordinary. No complex schemes or hidden actions. Everything took place during work hours and in plain sight of his colleagues. It was precisely this that allowed him to remain unnoticed. When the investigation gains access to the diary, it becomes clear that the key to what was happening lay not in laboratory processes or rare reagents. It was integrated into the daily work rhythm. In the photo lab, there was a custom of taking tea breaks. During the day, one of the employees would take on this minor duty. It was not formally recorded and did not attract the interest of management. In the first weeks after starting the job, Young gradually begins to take on this role. He is not insistent or conspicuous. To others, it looks like the typical helpfulness of a new employee trying to be useful and not cause trouble. Preparing the tea gives him control over the process. He fills the cups himself, arranges them on the table himself, and observes who takes which one. This allows him to accurately match a person to a cup without drawing any extra attention. According to the diary, the substance was added selectively, not to all the cups, only to those intended for specific people. The amounts were calculated in advance. The entries record the dosages and the expected reaction, without emotional commentary. After this, he observes. He notes the time when the first signs of deteriorating health appear. He compares the reactions. He makes brief conclusions. As events unfold, the formulations become shorter and the calculations more precise. The exposure was spread out over time. This lowered suspicion and created a sense of randomness. The employee's condition was attributed to fatigue, seasonal illnesses, and the peculiarities of working with chemical substances. The role of the person who makes the tea was not perceived as a source of risk. On the contrary, it was seen as a sign of participation in the life of the team. This further reduced the likelihood of suspicion. The investigation also establishes that Young avoided situations where his actions could be directly observed. He chose moments when no one else was around and made sure that everything looked normal.
Entries appear in the diary about who drinks their tea immediately and who leaves their cup on the table. These observations helped him more accurately correlate his notes with the real condition of the people and the timing of their symptoms. The reconstruction shows that what happened was not an improvisation. It was a consistent scheme, integrated into a normal workday. A routine office ritual became the weapon. Its ordinariness provided cover and allowed him to operate for a long time without direct suspicion. It is from this moment that the scheme ceases to be abstract and begins to break down into specific episodes, each of which can be tied to a time, people, and consequences. This becomes the basis for the next stage of the investigation. After the investigative actions are completed, the case files are transferred to the court. The story, which had long existed in reports, expert analyses, and reconstructions, moves to the stage of a public trial. Here, they are no longer searching for answers. They are testing whether the answers will hold up in a legal form. The hearings begin on December 20th, 1972, at the Crown Court in St. Albans, Hertfordshire. It is this court that is hearing the case related to the events at the photo lab. Present in the courtroom are journalists, relatives of the victims, and experts whose conclusions formed the basis of the prosecution. The atmosphere is calm and restrained. The proceedings are perceived as a formal confirmation of what had already become obvious during the investigation. Throughout the trial, Young remains composed. He shows no emotion and reacts little to the arguments of the parties. He answers questions briefly and formally. He retracts his confession and consistently adheres to his line of defense. The prosecution builds its position around concrete evidence. At the center of the case is the diary with its dosage calculations and observational notes. Experts confirm the document's authenticity and its direct link to the events at the photo lab. Toxicologists' reports show that the deterioration of the employee's health was not accidental and fits the recorded scheme. Particular attention is paid to the reconstruction of his actions in the office. The jury is told how everyday work rituals were used as a tool of harm. Every detail is compared with witness testimonies and the timeline of events. The picture comes together logically and without internal contradictions. The defense insists on insanity. The lawyers refer to past medical assessments and Young's time in a specialized institution. These arguments are considered by the court but do not change the overall assessment of what occurred. The prosecution's experts point to his calculation and control, the sequence of his actions, the adjustment of doses, and the recording of results in the diary testify to his understanding of the consequences and the consciousness of his decisions. On January 12, 1973, the jury returns a verdict. Young is found guilty on the key counts. The court imposes a life sentence without specifying a minimum term for release. After the decision is announced, Young makes a brief statement. He says the system is mistaken and that his release is possible in the future. These words are recorded in the court protocol and elicit no reaction in the courtroom. The court's decision formally concludes the photo lab case. However, it does not close the story itself. The consequences of these decisions will continue to unfold outside the courtroom. Young is sent to the maximum security Wakefield prison, where the rest of his life passes without public attention. In the institution, he behaves with restraint. Almost no disciplinary infractions are recorded. He does not participate in conflicts and spends most of his time alone. According to available data, his interest in toxicology persists. Over the years, he maintains limited contact with other famous convicts, including Ian Brady. All of this is under the control of the administration. Over time, his name stops appearing in reports. He becomes part of a closed world where past deeds are not discussed or revisited. In August 1990, at the age of 42,
Young is discovered in his cell with no signs of life. A medical examination records cardiac arrest. The incident receives no further development. This story concludes without a continuation. But the case itself remains an example of how systemic decisions and an underestimation of risk can have consequences that manifest long after a sentence has been passed.